A black family, the Bennetts, move into what appears to be a picture-perfect suburban neighborhood, hoping for peace and community. But their arrival stirs deep, unspoken tensions, especially from longtime resident Mrs. Margot Aldridge, whose friendly facade quickly gives way to cold hostility. When the Bennetts host a warm, welcoming barbecue to meet their new neighbors, what should have been a joyful gathering takes a dark turn. A 911 call is made. Police are dispatched, but when officers arrive and realize who they're dealing with, everything changes. The mood shifts. The silence becomes deafening. What happened at that barbecue would leave the entire neighborhood shaken, a moment that revealed this was never just about noise or newcomers. It was about power, prejudice, and a long overdue reckoning. Let's find out what really went down. Before we jump in, drop a comment with where you're watching from. And if this story of community, truth, and redemption speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. The moving truck rumbled down Maple Hollow's main road, its tires crunching over cobblestone pavers lined with sycamores that cast long shadows across the trimmed lawns. The neighborhood looked like a postcard. Storybook homes, white porches wrapped in vines, and flower beds curated like museum exhibits. To an outsider, Maple Hollow was the kind of place where nothing unexpected ever happened. But as Julian Bennett pulled his silver SUV to a gentle stop in front of their new home, a subtle shift stirred behind curtained windows and tidy blinds. The Bennetts were not just any new family, they were the kind that would stir ghosts in quiet places. Julian stepped out first, adjusting the sleeves of his charcoal gray sweater, eyes scanning the two-story brick colonial that now belonged to them. It stood with a kind of quiet defiance, its ivy-clad facade weathered but dignified. Elena emerged next, sunglasses pushed into her hair, holding the hand of their 8-year-old son, Caleb, while 13-year-old Ava leapt out from the back seat, already raising her camera to snap a shot of the towering oaks in their front yard. "This is it," Julian said, exhaling slowly. "New chapter." Elena smiled faintly, but something about the stillness unsettled her. The air was too quiet. No one came out to greet them, though she could feel eyes watching. The feeling lingered like the neighborhood was holding its breath. Inside, the house had charm. Original crown moldings, hardwood floors, antique brass fixtures. Ava wandered upstairs, filming a video for her vlog while Caleb raced to claim the bigger room. Julian and Elena moved together through the rooms like co-architects of their next life, but outside, behind the manicured shrubs and rose trellises, things were already shifting. At the end of the block, behind lace curtains drawn just enough to peek through, Mrs. Margot Aldridge watched them, with narrowed eyes. She didn't flinch when Elena waved politely in her direction. She simply stepped back as though even the wave was an intrusion. Margot had lived on Maple Hollow for nearly 45 years. In her mind, this street didn't need modernizing. It needed preserving. "Bennetts," she muttered to herself, voice a soft crackle in the silence. Of course they'd be the ones to buy the Holloway place. The house had belonged to a retired judge, staunch conservative, and to Margot, part of the last line of proper Maple Hollow residents. That the new occupants included a black family with a district attorney for a father and a civic health consultant for a mother reeked of irony she couldn't swallow. Margot had not voted for change in the last HOA election, nor had she approved of expanding the neighborhood school's curriculum to include revisionist histories. And now, here came the Bennetts, with their polished credentials and their children who'd probably be lauded in school board meetings and featured in glossy community newsletters. She felt the fabric of the neighborhood fraying by the second. Across the street, Mrs. Gloria, 82 and nearly blind in one eye, peeked from behind her sunflower-patterned curtains and smiled. She remembered when Maple Hollow had no sidewalks, when children played stickball in the street, and when the only thing you needed to join the neighborhood was respect. Her eyes crinkled as she watched the young family unload. "They look like good people," she whispered, though there was no one around to hear. Later that day, Julian made his rounds. A natural diplomat even outside the courtroom, he rang doorbells and introduced himself with a warm smile and a steady handshake. Some neighbors greeted him politely, if stiffly. Others answered their doors with exaggerated surprise, as that they hadn't been watching since the moving truck arrived. Only Mr. Raphael, a quiet man in his late 40s with sun-worn skin and calloused hands, lingered in conversation. "You've got a beautiful family," he said, his voice thick with a soft Mexican accent. "If you need help with the garden, shrubs, soil, just say the word. I've been in landscaping for years." Julian thanked him with a smile. "That means a lot, still figuring this all out." Raphael looked around, leaned in just slightly. "You'll like it here," he said, "but just keep your head on straight. This neighborhood doesn't always show its teeth." Julian nodded, filing that away. That evening, Elena sat on the porch with a mug of tea, watching the sunset in honey-colored streaks. Ava had already uploaded her first video, a Welcome to Maple Hollow vlog, complete with slow-motion pans and a moody jazz soundtrack. Caleb was curled up with a graphic novel about space pirates. It should have felt peaceful. It didn't. Elena caught movement across the street, Mrs. Aldridge again, this time standing at the edge of her lawn, arms folded, dog leash in hand. Her little spaniel barked once at Caleb through the open window, and Margot tugged the leash sharply. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away. "She didn't even say hello," Elena murmured. "She doesn't have to," Julian replied, stepping outside and sitting beside her. "She said enough by watching." Ava joined them moments later, her camera resting on her lap. "She watched me the whole time I was filming today," she said, voice thoughtful. "Like I was doing something wrong. I think she hates us." "People fear what they don't understand," Julian said. "We give them time, and we don't change who we are." "But what if they don't want us to fit in?" Ava asked. Elena exchanged a look with Julian. That was the question, and it didn't have an easy answer. The next morning, a basket of muffins was left on their doorstep. No card, no note. The act was ambiguous. Hospitality or passive appeasement? Elena brought it in, turning the gesture over in her mind. Later that day, as Ava explored the wooded path behind their backyard, she found a rusted sign half buried beneath leaves. Holloway private property. No trespassing. Someone had tried to rip it down, but it still stood crooked and defiant. That night a soft knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Gloria, cane in hand and eyes warm. "I just wanted to say, welcome," she said softly. "I hope this place treats you better than it treated others before you." Julian furrowed his brow. "Others?" Mrs. Gloria hesitated. "There was a couple, years ago. They wanted to buy that house too. Real nice folks. It didn't work out. They said it was a problem with the mortgage paperwork, but sometimes papers disappear around here." Elena's stomach tightened. "Why are you telling us this?" "Because this place has two faces," Gloria said. "One for the brochure, one for the mirror." As she turned to leave, her cane tapped twice against the porch rail, a rhythmic beat that sounded strangely like a warning. The first week passed with more watching than speaking. No one complained when Ava biked around the block, but no one waved either. Caleb's teacher called Elena to say he was struggling to adjust socially. That night he asked her why the kids didn't play with him at recess. One of them said our house used to belong to someone important, that we ruined it. "They're just words," Elena said gently. "But they felt like bullets," Caleb whispered. On the 7th day, while Julian trimmed the hedges, a black SUV slowed in front of the house. The driver, a middle-aged man in sunglasses, rolled down his window. "You the new DA?" the man asked flatly. "Deputy," Julian replied, straightening. The man nodded once, slowly. "Hope you can keep Maple Hollow as safe as the last guy did." And then he drove off. That night Elena couldn't sleep. She stood at the bedroom window, staring across the street at Margot's darkened house. A dim light glowed behind the curtains, like a watchtower keeping vigil. She didn't know what Margot's story was, but she could feel its weight like a storm building on the horizon. In the weeks to come, the Bennetts would discover that the veneer of Maple Hollow was thin, and beneath it lay a web of codes, secrets, and expectations. But for now, in the calm before the storm, the family sat in their living room, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, watching an old comedy movie together. Laughter filled the house, but outside silence pressed against the windows. And somewhere down the block, behind locked doors and drawn curtains, the neighborhood was preparing its next move. It was the second Saturday morning since the Bennetts moved in when Elena received her first invitation to a Maple Hollow Beautification Committee brunch, hosted at a neighbor's house down the block. The invitation was printed on thick ivory cardstock, edged in gold leaf, and addressed to Mrs. Julian Bennett, an outdated touch that made Elena chuckle dryly. Still, she saw it for what it was, an opening. Perhaps finally a chance to step into the rhythms of the community, to begin replacing suspicion with familiarity. Julian was skeptical. "Are you sure you want to go into that lion's den alone?" "It's a garden party, not a gladiator match," Elena replied, pulling a blouse from her closet. "If we want to be part of this neighborhood, we have to be visible, available." "Just be careful," he said, watching her closely. "Not every invitation is made in good faith." He was right to be cautious. When Elena arrived, the house, a sprawling craftsman nestled behind tall hedges, was already buzzing with activity. She stepped into a backyard straight out of a landscaping magazine. Rows of white lawn chairs had been arranged around a trellis wrapped in wisteria. Tables were laid with pitchers of cucumber water and glass dishes of fruit tarts. The women in attendance, mostly white, mostly older, all wore pastel tones and smiled with a kind of practiced warmth that felt just a few degrees shy of sincerity. "Welcome," said a tall woman with platinum hair and a voice like champagne over ice. "You must be Elena. I'm Corinne. So glad you could join us." As Elena took her seat, she couldn't help but feel like she was being auditioned. Polite questions about her work and family gave way to pointed inquiries masked as compliments. "You're so well-spoken. You and your husband are so accomplished. That must make it easier to relate to people here. You're very involved already. That's rare." The conversation shifted to the neighborhood's upcoming Heritage Garden Day, a long-standing Maple Hollow tradition where residents would open their private gardens to tours, accompanied by a tea social and awards presentation. "We're quite proud of our gardens," Corinne said, a note of pride hardening her tone. "It's about maintaining the spirit of Maple Hollow. Some people just plant whatever they like, but it's important to honor our legacy." "I'd love to get involved," Elena offered. A few women exchanged glances. Corinne smiled thinly. "Of course. We'll keep you informed." The meeting ended shortly after, but as Elena walked home, she felt strangely hollow. She'd gone seeking community and returned with curated politeness and the distinct sensation of being tested, not welcomed. That afternoon, Julian met with a local judge for lunch, and Ava decided to go for a walk, her camera around her neck, headphones over her ears. She wandered down a path that split behind Mr. Raphael's house and curved into the woods behind the Bennett home. That's when she saw it. Someone, an older man with a gray hoodie, spray painting something behind a row of bushes near their fence. Ava froze, heart pounding. She crouched low, slowly raised her camera, and clicked. The shutter was quiet, but the man turned his head slightly. She caught a brief glimpse of a profile, a hard jawline, a beard flecked with gray, and a jacket with an HOA emblem stitched near the collar. He vanished seconds later, slipping back through the trees and disappearing into the hollow. Ava ran home breathless and showed the photo to Julian. The image was slightly blurred, but the jacket logo was unmistakable. "You said that's the HOA insignia?" Julian asked, leaning closer. Ava nodded. "He was tagging our fence. I couldn't see what, but I think it was something bad." They went to investigate and found the graffiti, crude, hastily written in black spray paint, already dripping in the summer heat. It read, "Outsiders never stay." Julian stared at the message. For a long moment, his jaw clenched. That night he called the HOA president, a man named Gerald Morris. Gerald was polite but evasive. "That's very troubling," he said. "We'll look into it. Vandalism is unacceptable." Julian pressed. "Do your board members wear branded jackets?" "Well, yes, some do. But that's hardly evidence of anything. Could be anyone. I suggest you file a report, Julian. Go through the usual channels." Julian hung up, feeling stonewalled. "They're not going to help." "They might have ordered it," Elena replied flatly. The next day, Caleb came home from school subdued. Elena noticed him picking at his food, barely speaking. When she asked what was wrong, he hesitated, then pulled a crumpled paper from his backpack. It was a drawing, 2 stick figures holding hands, standing in front of a burning house labeled Bennett's. Above them, written in crayon, were the words, "Go back to where you belong." "It was in my cubby," Caleb said softly. "I didn't show the teacher." Julian sat at the table in silence, the photo from Ava's camera in one hand, the drawing in the other. A knot formed in his chest, not fear but fury. "This isn't just a few rude neighbors," he said. This is something organized. That evening, Elena heard a knock on the door and found Mr. Raphael standing on their porch, hands in his pockets. He looked uneasy. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. "When I first moved here, I worked on the gardens for half the neighborhood. Quiet work. Nobody bothered me. But a few years ago, another family tried to buy the Holloway house. Black couple. Doctors, I think. They pulled out at the last second." "What happened?" Elena asked. "I don't know the full story, but they said the mortgage bank gave them trouble. Delays, paperwork lost, permits denied. Same pattern I've seen before. Only certain families get the full Maple Hollow welcome." Julian leaned against the doorframe, watching Raphael carefully. "Why tell us now?" "Because I see what they're doing," Raphael said, "and you're not the kind to run." The next morning, Elena received an email. It was from Corinne. The subject line read, "Concerning the upcoming garden tour." It was brief and oddly formal. "Dear Elena, we appreciate your enthusiasm, but due to limited space, we've decided to restrict this year's tour to previously featured gardens only. We look forward to your continued participation in future events. Warmly, the Beautification Committee." The same afternoon, flyers appeared in the community mailboxes, unsigned, printed anonymously. The flyers proposed a new community harmony resolution, calling for a ban on unsanctioned events that were not in line with neighborhood values. Julian read the wording aloud at dinner. "Events must reflect the established traditions and cultural tone of Maple Hollow." What does that even mean? "It means no cookouts, no music, no us," Elena said bitterly. Ava, who had been silently flipping through her photographs, paused. "I think I have something." She pulled up a new image, one she hadn't shared before. It showed Mrs. Aldridge standing in the shade near the woods, speaking with a man in a gray hoodie. It was the same man who tagged their fence. His face was mostly hidden, but the body language, intimate, close, was unmistakable. "She's part of it," Julian said quietly, "maybe even leading it." The mood in the room turned electric. "Then what do we do?" Elena asked. Julian stood, his jaw tight with resolve. "We go public." By the time Elena set the final wine glass on the table, the sun had begun to dip low over Maple Hollow, casting amber light across the backyard like a painter's final brushstroke. The Bennett home stood quietly elegant behind her, lit softly from within, and outside, strings of warm fairy lights crisscrossed above a long banquet table dressed in linen and adorned with fresh eucalyptus and candles in mason jars. The smell of rosemary chicken and grilled peaches wafted through the air, layered with the comforting aroma of fresh bread. On the surface, it was the picture of hospitality, a gesture of goodwill, a neighborhood gathering. But beneath that charm was something electric, coiled tight with uncertainty. Elena knew this wasn't just dinner. It was a test. "Are you sure about this?" Julian asked from the kitchen door, wiping his hands on a towel. "No," Elena said honestly, smoothing a napkin beside a plate, "but we can't sit in the shadows forever." Julian watched her with a mix of admiration and concern. She was right, but the undercurrent of unease that had been flowing beneath their lives here in Maple Hollow wasn't subtle anymore. It had begun to churn. The invitations had gone out a week ago. Elena delivered them by hand, each one printed on thick cardstock, a friendly, welcoming message in looping script. "Please join us for an evening of food, conversation, and community at the Bennett residence." She smiled as she passed them out, doorstep to doorstep, mailbox to mailbox, making eye contact with neighbors who offered hesitant smiles, curt nods, or in some cases closed doors without a word. And yet, something interesting had happened in the days since. A handful of people, neighbors they hadn't spoken to beyond pleasantries, had stopped by while walking their dogs or watering their lawns, polite compliments on the flowers Elena had planted, casual questions about the menu, a comment here, a smile there. It was enough to suggest curiosity, or perhaps cautious rebellion against the unspoken hierarchy of Maple Hollow. Even Mrs. Gloria had called, asking if she could bring her famous lemon bars. "If this neighborhood forgets how to break bread," she'd said, "we might as well pack up and live in fear." Ava and Caleb had helped set up. Ava, in particular, had taken charge of ambiance, curating a playlist, arranging the seating, and snapping photos along the way. But behind her camera lens, she was more observant than she let on. She caught the way Mrs. Aldridge stared from her window across the street, arms crossed like a sentinel. She noticed how the SUV that always parked at the end of the block, the one she suspected belonged to the man in the hoodie, had circled the house twice in the last hour. Even Caleb seemed more aware, more cautious, his wide eyes scanning the street as they set out citronella candles. By 6:30 p.m., the first guests began to arrive. Mr. Raphael showed up with a plate of empanadas and a six-pack of craft beer. "They say no one in this neighborhood talks," he said with a smile, "but food makes everyone loosen up." Soon after came the Lewises, a biracial couple from 3 houses down, followed by a young black woman named Denise who had just moved in alone. Then came Mrs. Gloria, who kissed Elena on both cheeks like she was family. One by one the seats began to fill. Half full now, more than the Bennetts had expected, but still sparse enough to feel the absences. At 7:02 p.m. the air shifted. A hush fell over the backyard as Mrs. Margot Aldridge stepped through the gate, escorted by a middle-aged man Elena didn't recognize, tall, tan trench coat, hair silver at the temples. He was the same man from Ava's blurred photo. Ava felt her heart skip. Margot's entrance was quiet, almost ceremonial. She wore a crisp blue blazer and gloves, despite the warmth in the air, and carried a bottle of wine with a label in French. Her eyes swept over the crowd, cold and calculating. She smiled at no one. "Mrs. Aldridge," Elena greeted her, careful to keep her voice neutral. "We're glad you could make it." "Curiosity," Margot replied with a faint smile. "It has a strange way of pulling us where we don't belong." Her words hung in the air like smoke. They took their seats. Conversation resumed, but softer now, hushed beneath the music. Julian stood at the head of the table, raised a glass, and offered a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, voice steady. "To neighbors who become friends, and to community. Not just the word, but the work it takes to build one." There were murmurs of agreement. Glasses clinked, plates were passed. For a while the evening began to feel normal. Laughter bubbled up in places. Stories exchanged between bites of lemon bars and slices of grilled corn pie. Elena felt hope stir in her chest. Maybe this could work. Then came the toast. It happened just as the main course ended. Margot stood slowly, glass in hand, the stranger beside her watching with a faint smirk. "If I may," she said, her voice clear and practiced, "I'd like to offer a few words of my own." Elena's smile froze. Julian tensed. Ava lowered her camera instinctively. Margot looked down the length of the table, her expression unreadable. "Maple Hollow has always stood for something. History, order, continuity, and as someone who's lived here longer than most, I take pride in our traditions. They are what make this neighborhood exceptional." A silence settled over the table, sharp and brittle. "But times change," she continued, "and with change comes discomfort. We are not obligated to embrace every new face with blind enthusiasm, no matter how educated, or how well-intentioned." There it was. The mask peeled back. Elena opened her mouth, but Julian gently touched her hand. "And yet," Margot said, tone shifting slightly, "here we are, at your table, sharing your food, listening to your stories. Whether we like it or not, you've become part of Maple Hollow. I only hope," she paused, letting her gaze lock on Julian, "that you understand what that truly means." The words weren't a compliment. They were a warning. She sat. The air turned ice cold. Then from the end of the table, Mrs. Gloria cleared her throat. "You know, Margot," she said, her voice calm but laced with fire, "when my husband and I moved in, you sent us a brochure on how to keep our hedges uniform. Said it was a Maple Hollow custom. Do you remember that?" Margot blinked, lips pressed together. "But I also remember when your husband needed help covering up that mess with the tax office. And you came to me like a neighbor, not a gatekeeper." Whispers stirred. Mrs. Gloria's voice was low, but everyone heard it. "I came tonight because I've had enough of sitting by, while you rewrite the rules to suit your fear. The Bennetts belong here. They show more grace in one evening than you've shown in a lifetime." Julian exhaled slowly. Elena squeezed his hand. For a long moment no one spoke. Then the man beside Margot stood. "Well," he said, voice low, "I think it's time we took our leave." And they did. No goodbyes, no pleasantries, just two shadows slipping back through the gate into the night. The silence lingered for several heartbeats. Then Mrs. Lewis raised her glass. "To new beginnings," she repeated. "To new beginnings." the table echoed. As the evening wound down, Elena and Julian stood at the gate, thanking guests as they left. The air was thick with something they couldn't quite name. Tension, yes, but also something brighter. Defiance. Hope. Inside, Ava uploaded her photos. One image stood out. Mrs. Aldridge standing stiff at the table, her stranger companion looking directly at the camera, as if daring Ava to keep watching. "Who is he?" she asked Julian quietly, showing him the picture. Julian studied it, his brow furrowed. "I don't know," he said, "but I think we'll find out." Back outside, Elena wandered through the yard alone, extinguishing candles, wrapping up leftovers. She paused near the fence line and noticed something strange. Muddy footprints, too large to be from any guest. They trailed from the side of the house to the bushes near the back gate. She followed them slowly, her skin prickling with unease. There, tucked behind a rose bush, she found it. A burned scrap of paper with jagged edges. On it, faint but legible, were the words, "They don't know what's buried under this garden." Her breath caught. She looked up, heart pounding, eyes scanning the shadows. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked closed. The morning after the dinner party, the Bennett household was unusually quiet. Even Caleb, typically awake by sunrise and hunting for cereal, slept in longer than usual. Julian stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the burned scrap of paper Elena had found in the garden. He turned it over in his hands for the 5th time, the words etched into his brain like a warning carved in stone. They don't know what's buried under this garden. "I don't think it was just a metaphor," Elena said behind him, her voice low and taut with unease. She leaned against the doorway, arms folded tightly over her chest. "Somebody planted that note on purpose. That wasn't blown over by the wind. That was a message." Julian nodded. "A threat, more like." From upstairs, the creak of floorboards signaled Ava's footsteps. She emerged moments later with her laptop and camera, clutching them like sacred tools. "I've been reviewing all the footage," she said, setting her things on the dining table. "Not just the dinner party. Everything since we moved in. I caught something weird last week, behind the shed." She pulled up a video, grainy, shot at dusk. A dark silhouette moved quickly past the back fence. The frame was shaky, but what caught Julian's eye was the object in the figure's hand. A shovel. He leaned in. "Pause it right there." Ava froze the frame. It was blurry, but the profile was unmistakable. The man from the barbecue, the same one who arrived with Mrs. Aldridge. Julian's jaw tightened. That man isn't just a friend. He's hiding something. Later that day, Julian made a quiet call to a contact at the district clerk's office, a friend from law school who owed him a favor. He provided the man's photo and asked for a name, anything. Within hours, the answer came back. Franklin Darnell, retired real estate developer, sued 3 times in the last 10 years for discriminatory housing practices, though none of the lawsuits had ever made it past the discovery phase. Connections to various neighborhood councils and historic preservation committees all over the county. His last known involvement? Maple Hollow Heritage Trust. "That's not just coincidence," Julian muttered. He brought the information to Elena and Ava. Elena took one look at the name and froze. "I've seen that before," she said. She rifled through a folder of materials given to them at closing. HOA guidelines, bylaws, neighborhood brochures. At the back of one of the pamphlets, Maple Hollow, a legacy of quiet excellence, was a note that said, "Produced in partnership with the Franklin Darnell Civic Foundation." Ava raised her eyebrows. "So, he's been pulling strings in this neighborhood for a long time." Julian nodded. "And he doesn't like anything or anyone that threatens that control." That evening, as dusk crept across the lawn and the shadows stretched long and thin, Julian took a quiet walk to Mrs. Gloria's house. Her porch light was already on, casting a warm yellow glow onto the steps. She answered the door with her usual gentle smile. "I had a feeling you'd stop by," she said, ushering him inside. Julian sat across from her in the small book-filled sitting room, the walls adorned with sepia-toned family portraits and delicate watercolors of roses. He placed the pamphlet and the note on the table between them. "Tell me what you know about Franklin Darnell." Mrs. Gloria's smile faded. She glanced down at the paper, then back at Julian. "You're not the first person to come asking about him," she said. "Years ago, when Maple Hollow was being beautified, he was brought in to advise the Preservation Council. Quiet meetings, off-the-record decisions. Some homes were remodeled to fit the aesthetic. Others were mysteriously bought out. Bought out? Julian asked. Families were pressured to leave. People of color mostly. Offers came in low, but the pressure came high. Inspections, citations, rumors that drove property values down until folks had no choice but to sell. It was never official. Nothing on paper. Just shadows. Julian sat back, fury simmering beneath the surface. So, this wasn't just personal. It was systematic. Mrs. Gloria nodded. Franklin helped create the image of Maple Hollow as it is today. And Margot? She was his mouthpiece. She gave it all that southern charm gloss. You'd think she was selling sweet tea, not segregation. Julian returned home just after 10. He found Elena in the living room staring at a manila envelope that had been slid under their door. "Someone dropped this off while you were out," she said. Her voice was tense. Inside the envelope was a stack of papers, property records, annotated maps, and a single typed page labeled Restricted Zone Proposal, 1996. The document outlined a now abandoned HOA amendment that would have redrawn Maple Hollow's zoning lines to exclude non-conforming households under the guise of historical preservation. The phrasing was deliberately vague, but the intent was clear. They wanted to gerrymander the neighborhood, Elena whispered, to keep it white. A handwritten note at the bottom of the proposal read, FD. Need Margot to secure the board vote quietly. Don't let this become public. Julian sat down hard, the breath leaving his lungs in a rush. This is the blueprint, he said. This is the smoking gun. They were interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. Ava peeked through the window and stiffened. It's Mrs. Aldridge. Julian opened the door cautiously. Margot stood in a trench coat, her silver hair pulled back into a tight bun. She looked older tonight, drawn, but her eyes still held that cold fire. May I come in? She asked. Julian led her inside, but not without hesitation. Margot stepped into the living room, glancing at the documents on the coffee table. She didn't look surprised. I assume you figured it out, she said. Who Franklin is, what he's done. You helped him, Julian said flatly. You were the gatekeeper. I was a woman trying to protect the integrity of my neighborhood, she replied, voice sharp. You think it was easy? Men like Franklin, they don't make room for dissent. They expect loyalty. Quiet obedience. And once you give it once, it becomes your prison. Sounds like you made that prison pretty comfortable, Elena snapped. Margot's expression softened just slightly. You have every right to hate me, but understand this, he's not done. Franklin doesn't back down. He escalates. Is that a warning? Julian asked. Margot met his eyes. It's a confession. She turned to leave, but paused at the door. You should check the garden shed, she said, underneath the floorboards, before someone else does. Then she was gone. The moment she left, Julian grabbed a flashlight. Elena followed, and Ava, refusing to be left behind, grabbed her camera. In the garden, the night air was damp and heavy with tension. Julian pried open the old wooden shed, its hinges groaning in protest. Inside, everything looked ordinary at first. Tools, bags of fertilizer, garden stakes. But in the back corner, the floorboards were uneven. Julian knelt and pulled one up. Beneath the boards was a rusted tin box. He opened it slowly. Inside were photos, old, faded, curling at the edges. A black family standing in front of the Holloway house. Children playing on the lawn. A newspaper clipping with the headline, Family Backs Out of Historic Maple Hollow. Purchase citing financial hurdles, and a letter. Typed. Cold. We regret to inform you that the Maple Hollow Historic Council has rescinded its offer to assist with your restoration plans. Due to community concerns, your application is no longer viable. Elena inhaled sharply. They forced them out. Ava knelt beside her parents, silent, clicking photos. Julian picked up the letter, rage burning in his chest. This ends now. The next morning he went to the local news station. The news segment aired on a quiet Sunday morning, one of those cool, crisp days where everything in Maple Hollow should have felt idyllic. Instead, the air hung heavy with anticipation. Julian had sat down with a respected local journalist, laying out everything. The documents, the zoning proposal, the photographs of the family forced out, the HOA's hidden history, the threats they'd received, and, most damning of all, the resurfaced connection between Franklin Darnell, Mrs. Aldridge, and the systemic exclusion that had shaped the neighborhood's past. The segment was thorough. It didn't sensationalize, it simply showed the truth, calmly and clearly, letting the facts speak for themselves. But it was devastating. By mid-morning, the neighborhood group chat was in full meltdown. Anonymous messages flew, screenshots circulated, HOA board members went silent. And within hours, a formal notice was emailed to every resident of Maple Hollow. An emergency community forum will be held this evening at the Recreation Hall to address recent allegations and restore community trust. Attendance is strongly encouraged. Elena stood in the kitchen with the email pulled up on her phone. Ava hovered beside her, sipping orange juice slowly, her eyes wide. "They're in damage control mode," Julian said as he entered, already in his suit. "They didn't expect this to blow up so fast." "They should have," Elena replied. "You gave them every chance to fix it quietly." Julian nodded. He turned to Ava. "I want you to stay home tonight." "No way," she said quickly. "I was part of this too. I filmed everything. I'm going." He didn't push back. He saw it in her eyes, that same fierce clarity Elena had. She'd grown up these past weeks, more than he ever intended. That night the rec hall filled quickly. Rows of folding chairs were arranged beneath bright fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly above. Residents came in clusters, some quiet, some tense, others defensive. There was an air of confusion among the newer families and guarded silence among the old guard. At the front, the HOA board sat behind a long table, flanked by microphones and bottled water. But it wasn't their presence that sent a ripple through the room. It was Franklin Darnell, seated quietly off to the side, his hands clasped on his lap, eyes hidden behind rimless glasses. Mrs. Aldridge wasn't at the table. She sat a few rows back, her posture erect, her expression unreadable. Julian entered with Elena and Ava at his side. Whispers followed them. Some turned their heads. Others looked away. He could feel the pressure of every gaze pressing down on him like a weight. But he didn't shrink. He walked straight to the front and sat in the designated speaker's seat. The microphone in front of him glinted under the overhead lights. "Mr. Bennett," the moderator said, a middle-aged woman from the city's diversity outreach office. "You may begin." Julian stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "For the past 2 months, my family and I have tried to build a life here. We've planted flowers. We've hosted dinners. We've walked the same sidewalks as you, waved from the same porches. But we've also been followed, vandalized, surveilled, and told, in so many words, that we don't belong." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "This isn't just about us. It's about what this neighborhood was built on and what some people still want it to be. The zoning documents, the forced removals, the paper trails. I've brought the evidence. I've put it in the public eye. You can't pretend it's gossip anymore." A murmur stirred in the audience. Some residents looked shocked. Others stared straight ahead, their faces blank. Julian reached into his folder and held up a copy of the restricted zoning proposal. This document was created to quietly reshape this neighborhood, to erase families that didn't fit a certain aesthetic. It didn't pass, but that didn't stop the ideas behind it. It just made them harder to detect. He turned slightly, locking eyes with Franklin Darnell. People like Mr. Darnell have operated in the shadows for decades. They manipulate policies, use heritage as a shield, and rely on polite society to look the other way. Julian turned back to the crowd. "I'm not here to ask for sympathy. I'm here to ask what kind of community you want to be." The room was silent. Then, slowly, Mrs. Gloria rose from her chair. "My husband and I moved into Maple Hollow in 1982, she began. "We were the first black family to do so. We were told it was a mistake, that the neighborhood wasn't ready. We stayed anyway. But not a day went by when we didn't feel like we had to earn our place over and over again." She looked toward the HOA board, then at Franklin. "I've seen this neighborhood push people out without ever raising its voice. That's not heritage. That's cowardice." Another neighbor stood, Mr. Raphael. "I've lived here 15 years, he said. "I do the yards, I plant the flowers. I've seen which homes get cited and which don't. It's not random." More voices followed, one after another. Young couples, older residents, parents whose children had played with Caleb or spoken to Ava at school. What started as quiet confessions turned into a chorus of testimonies. Then came the turning point. A white woman named Kathy, a longtime resident, stood and held up her phone. "I've been looking through old HOA newsletters," she said, "from 10 years ago. There's a piece here praising the integrity and discretion of our preservation consultant, Franklin Darnell. You know what else I found? She tapped her phone. Records showing my black neighbors got 6 citations in 1 year for fence height. I've never had one. My fence is the exact same. Now even the board looked shaken. Franklin finally stood. My only goal, he said, was to maintain the character of this neighborhood. I never forced anyone out. I simply advised on, "You don't get to hide behind language anymore," Julian cut in. "Not when your name is on eviction letters. Not when people were bullied out of their homes while you shook hands and passed out pamphlets." The moderator stepped in. "Please, one voice at a time." But the crowd had turned. The reckoning had arrived, and no amount of formality could hold it back. Margot Aldridge stood. Her voice cracked with something unfamiliar. Humility, perhaps, or the start of it. "I did what I thought was right," she said, "but I see now that I was preserving control, not community. I let fear speak louder than fairness." She looked at Elena, at Ava, then at Julian. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Whether it was sincere or just survival, no one could say. But it mattered. It was public. It was heard. In the aftermath, the HOA board was dissolved and restructured. A new leadership slate was elected, diverse, transparent, and publicly accountable. A restorative committee was formed to review past citations, grant requests, and complaints, and to issue formal apologies where necessary. The zoning proposal was archived publicly, a warning to future boards. Franklin Darnell quietly withdrew from all civic roles. His name was scrubbed from Maple Hollow's website and brochures. He never returned to another meeting. In the weeks that followed, Elena and Julian continued building the life they'd intended from the start. Their backyard became a meeting ground, sometimes casual, sometimes purposeful. Ava's photo series, This Is Us, The Real Maple Hollow, went up in the local library, drawing praise and a few side eyes, but always attention. Caleb brought home a drawing from a classmate, 2 stick figures smiling in front of a shared garden. One morning, as the sun rose over the neighborhood, Julian stood outside with a spade in hand. Elena joined him, carrying a sapling. "You sure about this?" she asked. He nodded. "New roots, stronger ones." Together they planted the tree, a red maple in the center of their front yard. Not a statement, a symbol, for memory, for truth, for everything that had been unearthed, and everything still growing. As they worked, neighbors passed by. Some waved, some stopped to chat. None turned away. Later that evening, a block-wide potluck replaced what used to be the Heritage Garden Day. This time there were foods from every culture, music from 3 continents, and laughter that didn't feel like it needed permission. The Bennetts had not just endured, they had helped transform. And in the quiet hum of a neighborhood beginning to heal, there was one shared truth rising like dawn behind the rooftops. Belonging isn't granted. It's claimed. 3 years later, Maple Hollow looked the same, at least from a distance. The brick homes still stood in tidy rows, their shutters freshly painted, lawns trimmed like green velvet carpets. Children still rode their bikes under the canopy of sycamores, and flags still fluttered quietly on porches as the seasons passed. But beneath that outward sameness, something had undeniably shifted, and it all began with what the neighborhood now referred to, respectfully but still carefully, as the reckoning. It had started with a barbecue, then a broadcast, then a storm of truth that blew the dust off decades of curated silence. And from the fallout, something wholly unexpected had begun to grow. Julian Bennett stood on the stage at the newly named Unity Garden Commons, a public space developed where a neglected corner lot once stood, just beyond the cul-de-sac where the historic zoning line had ended. The land had been converted into a thriving community garden, a gathering place, a teaching hub. The old cracked sidewalk had been replaced with mosaic tiles made by local schoolchildren, depicting scenes of neighbors planting, laughing, listening. It was, in many ways, the heart of the new Maple Hollow. Julian adjusted the mic, pausing for the applause to fade. "I still remember the first day we moved in," he began, his voice steady, tinged with memory. "We thought we were just buying a house, but what we found was a crossroads, a moment that asked us all who we really were, and who we wanted to become." A soft wind stirred through the crowd. Dozens of neighbors gathered with folding chairs, water bottles, and the quiet buzz of anticipation. Elena sat in the front row, holding Caleb's hand. He was 11 now, taller, more self-assured. Ava stood to the side, camera in hand as always, But this time she wasn't just recording history. She was preparing to tell it. Julian continued. We learned that a neighborhood isn't built with fences or bylaws or historic charm. It's built with courage, with conversations that make you uncomfortable, with the choice to do what's right, even when it costs you. Applause rippled again, stronger this time. In the back of the crowd stood Mrs. Gloria, cane in hand, flanked by younger volunteers from the garden. And just a few feet away, almost unnoticeable at first, stood Margot Aldridge. She looked different now. Her hair was shorter, silver-streaked and less polished. No gloves, no pearls. She didn't sit with the rest of the old guard anymore, not after she'd stepped down from the HOA and withdrawn from leadership circles. But she came to events like this, always at the back, always quiet. And she worked in the garden now, just one of many volunteers who'd decided that redemption had to be cultivated, not claimed. No one had forgotten what she did. But some, like Elena, had decided to forgive. And Margot, for her part, never once asked for it. She simply showed up. She weeded the soil. She let her silence do what apologies never could. After the ceremony, Julian stepped down from the stage and joined his family beneath a flowering trellis. Ava caught his eye, holding her camera like a scepter. You think they'll keep showing up? She asked. He followed her gaze. Neighbors chatting in clumps, kids running between garden beds, a food truck setting up near the curb. They're here, aren't they? He said. But for how long? Julian smiled. Long enough for their kids to think this is normal. Ava nodded slowly. She had just finished a documentary, What We Unbury, that had earned her a scholarship to film school. The title was hers, of course. A quiet homage to the box they found in the shed. The truths beneath the roots, the voices no longer silenced. She glanced toward the side of the garden where a plaque had been recently installed beneath a dogwood tree. This garden is dedicated to those who came before us, and to those who were pushed out before they could plant their roots. May their stories live here forever. Ava had designed the plaque herself. In the months after the reckoning, the Bennetts had worked closely with the new HOA board to establish a community equity task force. Elena had led a Truth and History initiative, digging through neighborhood records to preserve the stories that had nearly been erased. A new welcome guide was drafted, this time reviewed by residents of every background, and community-building grants were offered to residents who wanted to host cross-cultural events. Still, the road wasn't smooth. There were moments of backlash. A few homeowners sold their properties and left, claiming the neighborhood had lost its identity. Anonymous letters appeared in mailboxes during the first Juneteenth celebration, accusing the HOA of political correctness. A banner was vandalized during Pride Month, but each time the community responded faster, stronger, together. When a new family moved in, a Muslim couple with 3 kids, Elena was the first to knock on their door with a welcome basket. Mrs. Gloria organized a block meet and greet the next weekend. Even Margot, quiet and deliberate, brought over a tray of lemon bars, the same recipe Gloria had once shared with her decades ago. On a warm summer evening just after sunset, Julian and Elena sat on their porch, the lights of the Unity Garden twinkling softly across the street. Caleb had fallen asleep with a library book on his chest. Ava had gone out to meet friends. Elena leaned into Julian's shoulder, her voice quiet. Do you think we changed the neighborhood? Julian didn't answer right away. He watched the silhouettes in the garden, young and old, laughing as they harvested tomatoes by flashlight. I think we helped it change itself, he said. And that man, she asked. Franklin Darnell. Did he ever resurface? Julian shook his head. Last I heard, he sold his lake house and retired quietly out of state. Left behind more than one trail of closed doors. Elena nodded. He was a shadow, but shadows can't last in sunlight. Just then, a soft knock tapped at the gate. A young couple stood there, nervous smiles, a baby in a carrier, and a little girl clinging shyly to her mother's leg. Hi, the woman said. Sorry to bother you. We're the Yusufs. Just moved in next door. Elena's smile warmed like sunrise. You're not bothering us at all. Come in. Julian stood, brushing the dust off his jeans. You hungry? We've got extra cobbler. The little girl peeked out, curiosity brightening her eyes. The baby cooed in its sling. The family stepped through the gate, into the glow of porch light and the quiet heartbeat of a new beginning. Inside the house, Ava's camera sat on the table, still recording from earlier. A soft breeze stirred the curtains. And somewhere far beneath the garden and deeper still beneath the scars of silence, the roots of something new were spreading. Steady, stubborn, and unafraid. The story of the Bennetts in Maple Hollow mirrors the quiet but persistent challenges many families face today when stepping into spaces historically shaped by exclusion, whether racial, cultural, or economic. Despite outward appearances of diversity and inclusion, neighborhoods, institutions, and communities still harbor unspoken rules, silent gatekeepers, and systemic barriers designed to preserve control rather than foster unity. The Bennetts' courage in confronting hostility with grace, truth, and unwavering dignity offers a powerful reminder. True change doesn't begin with grand gestures. It begins with showing up, speaking up, and refusing to shrink. The lesson we can apply today is simple but profound. Belonging is not something we wait for others to give us. It's something we claim by living authentically and standing firm in the face of resistance. And when we uncover injustice, whether in a neighborhood, workplace, or school, we must choose not silence, but action. Because every voice raised in truth becomes a seed planted for a better, fairer future. And when enough of us commit to that work, even the deepest roots of prejudice can be unearthed and replaced with something stronger. Community built on respect, equity, and shared humanity. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.